Now, with all the knowledge we gained up to this point, it's now time for a brand new concept, a brand new thing that you sometimes need to do when testing, a brand new problem you sometimes need to deal with when testing, and it's time for a brand new example, though this is a far smaller, more focused example because I want to focus on one specific problem here: asynchronous code. Now, as always, if this doesn't tell you anything, definitely pick up some dedicated JavaScript resources first. Asynchronous code, in the end, simply is code, JavaScript code in this context here, which executes and which might take a bit longer to finish, which shouldn't block other operations from finishing first. And in JavaScript, asynchronous code typically is implemented either with help of callback functions, so functions that are accepted as parameters and which are then executed in the future once a certain longer taking or potentially longer taking operation is done, or you work with promises, which is the more modern way of dealing with asynchronous code. You might also know async await, but that's just using promises under the hood. So it's really callbacks or promises in the end. And in this example here, which you find attached, of course, you do get both. You have a function that uses a callback, this doneFN parameter, and you have a function that uses a promise. The function then always does the same thing. It generates a JSON web token based on some input that's encoded into the token and some secret that's used for signing. If you don't know what JSON web tokens are, you don't need to worry about that. It's not important. It is in the end some kind of hashed string, which can be used for authentication purposes, for example. So we have this function, and now let's say we want to test this function. Well, as always, we can write our testing file, and the project I provided to you already has vtest installed. So we write this testing file. And in there, as always, we start by importing it, and we can start writing our first test. And the first test maybe should test this function. And there I want to test that when I call this function, I do get back some token in the end. That could be the simple test I want to run here. So it should generate a token value, could be the test we define here. Now in our testing code, I then in the end want to have some test user email address, some dummy value, because we need to provide such a user email address to generate token. It's the first parameter. And therefore, that's my arranged value. And thereafter, we can call generate token. Of course, this is imported from async example. Now to generate token, we pass our user email, but now we don't get back the token. That's not how this function works. So this is not how we can use it. Instead, we have to pass a second parameter to generate token, which should be a function which is forwarded to the sign method of this third-party package, which in the end will invoke this function once the token has been generated. As a side note, just to avoid confusion, earlier in the course, I of course said that you should not test third-party code, third-party packages, and I want to clarify that we aren't testing the third-party package here. We're not testing whether it works correctly. Instead, I want to test whether with my input values, I'm invoking this function correctly to get back a token eventually. That's what I'm testing here. The line, of course, always is a bit blurry, but that's the thing I want to test here. That given valid input from my side, this function is able to do its job correctly. So therefore now I call generate token, and then I pass this callback function to generate token. And here we will eventually get two values by that third-party package which we're using, an error object or the token. And we get an error if generating the token failed for some reason, otherwise we get the token itself. And here I then expect, and for this I will import expect from vtest, I expect this token simply to be defined. It should not be undefined, it should exist. It will be some string, and I simply expect this to be defined, so that we don't get an undefined value. So that's the test I want to perform here. Now it looks a bit different compared to the tests we had before, because the expectation is now inside of this callback function, but let's see whether it works. If I run npm test here, we run vtest, and we enter watch mode because of the command I stored here in package.json. You could of course change this, but it runs my tests and it works. Perfect. So this is how we can test code that's asynchronous, right? Well, no. Let's comment out this test and let's test for something that should fail. Let's say we expect token to be the number 2. This definitely won't be the case, because we will always get back a string, not a number, and the string will also be much longer than just one character. Yet, if I change it like this, and I save this, and because of watch mode, all the tests will then execute immediately again, it still passes even though I'm clearly expecting an incorrect value here. And the reason for this behavior is that our test doesn't actually work. But you can make it work with asynchronous code.